How's it going, everybody? My name is Max, and today I'm going to be reading Hegel and the Transformation of Philosophical Critique by William F. Bristow, published by Oxford University Press. This book is about Hegel's epistemological project in the phenomenology, epistemological-ontological project in the phenomenology, how it was influenced by Kant, how Hegel's project in the phenomenology is basically interaction and conversation with Kant's critique of pure reason. So I'm going to start at the start, page 19. Is Kant's idealism subjective? Hegel consistently characterizes Kant's transcendentalism as subjectivism. In chapter 1, I develop Hegel's interpretation of Kant's idealism as subjectivism and provide a limited defense of it. In one sense, Kant's idealism is indisputably subjectivist. According to Kant's doctrine of transcendental idealism, we can know objects only as they appear to us, not as they appear in themselves. We can know objects only as they are relativized to our human standpoint. The distinctiveness of Hegel's reading emerges in response to the nature or the source of the Kantian relativization to our standpoint. Does this relativization have a source in Kant's conception of the nature of thinking or of the role of our activity and knowledge? Or is it, as some maintain, strictly a function of the ideality of space and time as forms of our sensibility, hence strictly a function of our passivity in knowledge? According to the view developed here, Kant's relativization and corresponding restriction of our knowledge is primarily a consequence of Kant's principle of apperception and the role it plays in the transcendental deduction of the categories. The principle of apperception articulates the essential, not existential, role of our epistemic agency in cognition. The identification of the essential role of our epistemic agency in cognition enables Kant to solve his main epistemological problem, the problem of the synthetic a priori knowledge, but only at the cost of subjectivism, of the relativization of our knowledge to our standpoint. I aim in this chapter to show that Kant's relativization of knowledge to our human standpoint follows from his articulation in the transcendental deduction of a normative structure, according to which we, as knowing subjects, can understand ourselves to be bound by norms in the norm-governed activity of knowing only to the extent that the highest order norms of the activity have their source ultimately in us. An ambiguity in subjectivism. Before turning to the transcendental deduction, it is necessary to distinguish Hegel's interpretation of Kant's idealism as subjectivism from another, with which it is sometimes confused. We are likely to hear in the characterization of Kant's idealism as subjectivism an objection or an accusation. Clearly, Kant intends, in his attempt to distinguish and to specify a transcendental idealism, to redeem our knowing as genuinely objective. It is, no doubt, a debatable and much debated question whether he succeeds. To say that Kant's idealism is subjectivism will likely say to us that he fails. Accordingly, to those who would defend Kant's epistemology often find it necessary to proceed by way of defending it against what one prominent Kant interpreter calls the subjective, psychologistic, phenomenalistic reading of Kant. This is Allison in Kant's Transcendental Idealism. I want to show first that Hegel is not guilty of the subjectivist reading of Kant that apologists of Kant's epistemology are concentrated to refute. This other subjectivist reading has many facets, but it is primarily distinguished by its interpretation of Kant's claim that we can know only appearances. Proponents of this reading take Kant to mean that this claim, that we can know only representations, which are in turn taken to be mental items or ideas in Berkeley's sense. The objects of our knowledge on this reading of Kant's view reduce them to these mental images or items, to ideas in Berkeley's sense. This subjectivist reading, according to which Kant's transcendental idealism is, in Peter Strawson's oft-repeated words, closer to Berkeley than Kant acknowledges, underwrites several objections to Kantian idealism. The most fundamental being that Kant fails on his interpretation in his professed aim to redress our claim to genuine objectivity in our knowledge. If Kant redeems only knowledge of the contents of our minds, that is, only knowledge of these mind-independent or subjective contents, then the insistence that this is knowledge of objects at all seems strained and seems to depend on the same considerations as Berkeley's similar insistence. Recent commentary makes a compelling case that the proponents of the subjectivist reading fail to let the Kantian distinction between transcendental and empirical standpoints, which is, of course, distinctive to Kant's procedure and foreign to the thought of Berkeley's or Descartes, inflect their interpretation of Kant's idealism. In particular, of his claim that our knowledge is only of appearances. Roughly, the empirical standpoint is the standpoint from which we make knowledge claims about empirical objects, whereas the transcendental standpoint is that philosophical standpoint from which we reflect a priori on the possibility of our knowing of objects. This duality in standpoints implies an ambiguity in the idealism-realism opposition, as well as a corresponding ambiguity in the claim that we know only appearances. The sense of the claim that we know only appearances depends on the standpoint from which it is made. Proponents of the subjectivist reading, in their failure to be sensitive to the significance of this duality and consequent ambiguity, interpret the claim as asserting that we can know only the modifications of the empirical subject. The claim so taken denies the possibility of knowledge of mind-independent objects at all. The defenders of Kant against the subjectivist reading argue, on the contrary, that we should understand Kant's claim that we know only appearances as made from the transcendental standpoint. Moreover, this claim is made from the transcendental standpoint is part of an account of the possibility of knowledge of mind-dependent objects from the empirical standpoint. That is, the possibility of empirical realism requires, according to Kant, transcendental idealism. Allison's account is explicit on this point. Kant finds, in reflecting on the possibility of our knowledge, that empirical knowledge of objects that are mind-independent from the empirical standpoint, has certain a priori conditions. Allison describes such conditions as epistemic conditions, in part to make them off both from psychological and from ontological conditions. A psychological condition would be merely a condition we need in order to know the object, rather than a condition through which alone the object as object of knowledge is possible for us at all. As Allison puts it, an epistemic condition has an objectifying function. Nevertheless, such conditions are not ontological, since they do not condition things themselves, but only objects qua objects of knowledge of experience. Allison holds that the mere fact of such a priori conditions of knowledge, which do not likewise condition things themselves, necessitates the distinction at all levels, at the level of transcendental reflection between appearances and things as they are in themselves. Hence, the fact of such epistemic conditions necessitates transcendental idealism, understood, however, not ontologically, but epistemologically. Taken ontologically, transcendental idealism implies that there are two sets of things: the sets of things in themselves, which we cannot know, and the set of appearances, representations, ideas, which we can. Understood epistemologically, transcendental idealism is a claim simply that human knowledge is governed by these conditions. On the subjectivist reading, Kant is taken to claim flatly that we can have no knowledge of mind-independent objects if we interpret Kant instead according to the specific dimensionality of transcendental philosophy, then we can take his idealism to consist in the claim that the possibility of knowledge of mind-independent objects from the empirical standpoint depends on a priori transcendental conditions. These conditions, which are subjective only from the standpoint of transcendental reflection, are necessary conditions for the possibility of our knowledge of objects from the empirical standpoint. This is an amazing distinction. In the context in which philosophical interest in Kant's epistemological idealism is won in a battle against subjectivist reading of it, Hegel's repeated insistence that Kant's idealism is subjectivism is perhaps bound to be misheard. In this context, a fairly common objection against Hegel's interpretation of Kant's epistemology is that Hegel conceives Kant's idealism in terms of a simple subjectivity as against objectivity, to use Graham and Bird's phrase. It is objected that Hegel fails to appreciate this ambiguity or dimensionality of the subjective-objective opposition specific to Kant's transcendental philosophy, and for this reason misperceives Kant's idealism in empirical psychological terms. However, it is clear from several passages that Hegel does not fail to appreciate the complexity of the subjective-objective opposition inherent in Kant's transcendental philosophy. In fact, one passage from the Encyclopedia Logic, Hegel explicitly discusses this complexity and ambiguity. He notes that one construal of the subjective-objective opposition in Kant is the opposition between, on the one hand, the contingent, particular, and subjective sequences of representations that are merely mine, and on the other hand, the objective over against these representations, which is universally shared among us, and which determines my merely subjective representations. This is roughly equivalent to the subject-object distinction from the empirical standpoint. According to Hegel in this passage, what distinguishes Kant's idealism is that these universal and necessary determinations, which constitute the empirically objective and determinations of thought, he has in mind, obviously, the pure concepts of the understanding, the categories. Kant has called, quote, Kant has called that which is in accord with thought, the universal and necessary, the objective, and rightly so. However, Kant's idealism is subjective idealism, according to Hegel, because the thought determinations, i.e. the categories, that constitute objectivity are again subjective. Hegel does not mean, obviously, that the categories are subjective in the sense of being contingent, private, particular representations, since it is exactly as universal and necessary that they constitute the objectivity and representation. In what sense are the categories subjective? Then, if they are universal and necessary determinations, and as such constitutive of objectivity and representation. Hegel writes, further, however, the Kantian objectivity of thinking is itself, again, subjective to the extent that the thoughts, i.e. the categories, although universal and necessary determinations, are merely our thoughts and separated from the thing as it is in itself by an insurmountable gulf. As I argue below, the suggestion here that the categories are subjective by virtue of being merely ours, as if the problem were that other thinkers might employ different categories, misrepresents both Kant's view and Hegel's own more considered interpretation of it. As we shall see, the insurmountable gulf to which Hegel refers here arises not because the categories by which we think may not hold for all thinkers, but because we think at all. The gulf is between thought, on the one hand, has its source in Kant's conception, the nature of ourselves as thinking beings. At this point, I mean merely to have shown that Hegel sees that Kant redeems the objectivity of our thought from the empirical standpoint by means of transcendental reflection that finds a priori conditions for this object knowledge. Hegel's characterization of Kant's idealism as subjectivism does not betray, as some suppose, a failure to appreciate the transcendental dimensions of Kant's idealism, but marks instead what might seem the undeniable fact that the transcendental conditions are again for Kant subjective. However, it turns out not to be undeniable that transcendental conditions are as such subjective. Kant scholars, in fact, dispute Hegel's claim that Kant's categories are subjective, arguing instead that only the forms of sensible intuition, space and time, are subjective. My presentation of Kant's interpretation of Hegel's interpretation begins by characterizing generally the epistemological problem to which Kant's critique of reason is addressed, and the so-called Copernican revolution in epistemology as Kant's general solution to the problem. Again, this background, we can formulate the controversy regarding the subjectivity of the categories more sharply. So what is Kant's problem of knowledge, or as Bristow says, the epistemological problem, page 25? It will be helpful to review familiar but important general features of Kant's epistemology. Kant distinguishes fundamentally between two heterogeneous factors in all of human knowledge, concepts on the one hand and intuitions on the other. These two factors correspond to two distinct faculties of human cognition, the faculty of thought, or the understanding, on the one hand, and the faculty of sensibility on the other. This distinction in faculties gives expression to the fact that we human beings are both active and passive in our knowledge. Active insofar as we think objects, but passive insofar as objects impress themselves upon our sensibility. The faculty of thought, or of the understanding, is spontaneous for Kant, in the sense that thought is a faculty for the synthesis of representation into higher, more general representations. Thought then is a faculty of concepts, since concepts are those representations by means of which we collect many representations under one general representation. Kant distinguishes concepts from intuitions by their generality and by the fact that they can relate, or they relate to objects mediately through other representations. Concepts so understood as functions of unity among other given representations are independently of intuition empty. Independently of intuition, concepts are insufficient for knowledge of an object. Intuitions, in contrast, are singular representations that relate immediately to objects, but like concepts, intuitions alone are not sufficient for knowledge of an object. This follows from the fact that our intuitions is sensible and our understanding discursive. That our intuition is sensible implies that we are passive with respect to it. The content of intuition arises for us through the object's affection of our sensitive faculty. Our understanding is discursive in the sense that we can know an object only through thinking it, which implies that we must combine representation together as given to the faculty of sensibility. That is, we must bring given representations under concepts. So neither concepts nor intuitions, neither thought nor sensibility alone is sufficient for knowledge. Hence, perhaps the most quoted sentence in Kant's critique of pure reason: thoughts without content are empty, intuition without concepts are blind. Kant's general epistemological problem, to which the critique of pure reason is addressed, is the problem of the possibility of synthetic a priori knowledge. What is this problem? In the Prolegoma, Kant describes the problem arising from an encounter with Hume's reflections on the notion of causality. Hume's discussion of causality serves to put Kant on notice that universal and necessary knowledge of objects, which causal judgments presuppose, cannot be justified on the basis of experience. The possibility of a priori knowledge, that is analytic, poses no particular problem because such knowledge expresses mere conceptual relations, not relations among real objects. The problem is to understand the possibility of a priori knowledge that is necessary and universal, that is not merely conceptual, but at the same time knowledge of objects. So necessary and universal knowledge, that is knowledge of objects in the real world. How is knowledge of objects possible prior to the object being given? How is synthetic a priori knowledge possible at all? On this question depends the possibility not only of metaphysics, according to Kant, but also of the pure natural sciences and of mathematics. In the preface to the second edition of the first critique, Kant characterizes the so-called Copernican revolution in epistemology as the key to his solution to the epistemological problem. Knowledge of the object prior to the object being given is possible, Kant contends, only insofar as our knowledge presents necessary prior conditions on the possibility of the object of knowledge, on the hypothesis that object must conform to our knowledge rather than. We can understand the possibility of the synthetic a priori knowledge on the hypothesis alone. We can understand the possibility of universal and necessary knowledge, that is, at the same time, knowledge of the object. A sort of relativization of our knowledge standpoint, that is, a sort of subjectivism, seems to follow immediately from this strategy. For solving the epistemological problem, Kant's view is that knowledge of the object prior to the object being given is possible just insofar as the object, as object of knowledge, is possible only through conditions that have their source in the knowing subject, that is, the source in us. So there's a footnote here. Though I am putting the point in terms of subjectivism rather than idealism, this accords with Allison's initial view discussed above. The very idea of epistemic condition brings with it a commitment to a. Kant proceeds here, namely finding the necessary conditions of objects of experience in us as knowing subjects, implies that we, in the particular sense in which we refer to ourselves as a sort of these conditions, do not belong as a proper part of the natural world we know or experience. Since we do so belong, this is difficult to make sense of, and I cast no light on this dark doctrine. Follows this move that we can know objects only as they are for our knowledge, for us, not as they are in themselves, if we understand the basic doctrine of Kant's transcendental idealism as the claim that objects of our knowledge are objects only insofar as they appear to us, not as they are in themselves, then his idealism is a consequence of his revolution in epistemology. Kant accounts for the possibility of a priori knowledge of objects by understanding the objects of knowledge to be merely subjective objects in the following sense. Since the object of knowledge is possible only through the conditions that have their source in the subject, though through conditions which are in some as yet unclarified sense subjective, the object is merely an object for the subject. Kant purchases the possibility of synthetic a priori knowledge at the price of the possibility of knowledge of things as they are themselves. It's profound. Although this general story may seem uncontroversial as general characterization of Kant's view, it is not. Our controversy arises out of the question, what is the nature of the subjective conditions through which knowledge is relativized to us, to our cognitive faculties in Kant's view? On a natural reading of some passages anyway, the subjective and subjectifying conditions are twofold, corresponding to the duality of cognitive faculties that is a main feature of Kant's epistemology. First, the a priori forms of our human sensibility, space and time, and second, the a priori forms of our thought of objects, the pure concepts of the understanding, or the categories. Both sets of conditions are subjective in the sense that we impose them as conditions that are necessary for our knowledge of objects. Accordingly, in both cases, the conditions have the consequence of relativizing our knowledge to objects considered as objects of knowledge for us, since in either case are the conditions understood as conditions of the things themselves. However, while some passages invite us to think of both sets of conditions as subjective, in this sense, other passages suggest that the sensible conditions on knowledge are alone subjective and ideal, while the intellect conditions are the categories are not. According to the Hegelian interpretation, our cognition is relativized to our standpoint not only, or not primarily, because of the ideality of forms by which we passively intuit objects, though obviously that plays a role, but because thinking itself is subjective of Kant's view, and we can know objects only through thinking them. So next time, take care.